70%. That is the share of China's high-end laptop market, a single operating system claimed within months of shipping, in the country that buys more personal computers than any other nation on Earth. Something with no Android underneath it. Something with no Windows license behind it at all. That something is HarmonyOS, and the number comes from GfK, an independent German research firm, not a company press release, not a lab demo. Let me tell you what that actually means in plain English. You know the feeling of an operating system update, forcing itself onto your machine, changing something you never asked to change. Now imagine building the alternative from nothing. And that is just the beginning, because this laptop was never really the story. Stick around, hit a quick like and subscribe, and by the end of this video you will understand exactly how a company legally cut off from Android and Windows built a working replacement for both. You already know the feeling. An operating system decides, without asking you, that today is the day it changes. A menu moves. A feature disappears. A machine you paid for starts running software you never fully chose. For more than 3 decades, the operating system business ran on an assumption nobody bothered to question out loud. Microsoft built the desktop, Google built the phone, and everyone else built on top of them. Not beside them, on top of them. Companies that tried to break that arrangement did not just fail. They became warnings. Microsoft spent over a decade and billions of dollars building Windows Phone, and it died anyway, unable to convince developers to build for a third option nobody trusted would still exist in 5 years. Samsung tried something similar with Tizen and quietly walked it back, folding the project into partnerships with the very companies it was meant to replace. Even massive telecom carriers who wanted a genuine alternative to Android and Windows eventually gave up and went back to licensing what everyone else was already using. The lesson the entire industry absorbed was simple. You do not build your own operating system unless you enjoy losing money in public for years, with no guarantee anyone will ever use what you built. Here is the wall as it stood in early 2019. No company outside of Cupertino, Redmond, or Mountain View had ever built an operating system from nothing and made it stick at global scale. Not because the code was impossible to write, because an operating system without applications is a beautifully engineered brick, and nobody had cracked the app ecosystem problem badly enough to try. Then, in May of 2019, the United States Commerce Department placed Huawei on its entity list. This was not a tariff. It was a legal wall between Huawei and its American suppliers, and it cut in 2 directions at once. It meant no more Google mobile services on new Huawei phones, no Play Store, no Gmail, no Maps, the entire invisible plumbing that makes an Android phone useful outside China. And it meant tightening access to the American-made chips that powered Huawei's Windows-compatible laptops. Picture a car company that still owns the factory, still owns the design, still knows exactly how to build every part on the line, but has just lost its license to install the engine. The cars keep coming off the assembly line. They simply cannot go anywhere. That is what an operating system ban actually does. It does not touch the hardware. It touches the one thing that makes the hardware usable. 3 months before that ban took effect, Huawei's Consumer Business Group chairman, Richard Yu, had already told reporters what would happen if it did. If Huawei could no longer use Android, he said, the company could switch to its own operating system immediately. At the time, it read like a bluff, the kind of thing executives say to sound prepared for a crisis they secretly hope never arrives. What almost nobody outside Huawei understood was that Yu had been circling this exact problem for years already, building toward a system that could never again be switched off by a decision made in Washington or Mountain View. His stated goal was never modest. He wanted one operating system, running on everything from a smartwatch to a car, controlled by nobody but Huawei. The wall went up in May. What came down the road 3 months later did not look like much, but it was already further along than anyone watching from the outside had any reason to expect. On August 9, 2019, in the southern Chinese city of Dongguan, Richard Yu walked onto a stage at Huawei's developer conference and announced a new operating system. He called it HarmonyOS. Within hours, the international press had already decided what it was. Analysts called it a rebrand. Tech outlets pointed out correctly that underneath the new name sat the same open-source Android code every other manufacturer was using. It was not a new operating system, the critics said. It was Android wearing a different jacket, dressed up for a press conference, and nothing more. They were not entirely wrong, and that is exactly what made the moment so easy to dismiss. HarmonyOS 1.0 did not launch on a phone. It launched on smart screens, televisions of all things, the least glamorous entry point imaginable for a company supposedly building the future of computing. No cameras, no headlines, no crowds outside a store waiting for launch day. You described a system built on a microkernel, designed from the start to scale from a device with a few kilobytes of memory to one with hundreds of gigabytes. Almost nobody outside Huawei's own engineering teams believed that claim mattered yet because there was no phone to prove it on. They said the same thing about Android in 2008, when critics called it a clumsy imitation of the iPhone that Google would quietly abandon within 2 years. We all know how that ended. Here's what most people get wrong about that Dongguan announcement. It was never intended to replace Android that day. You had said as much to reporters that same year. Current products would stay on Android for as long as the door stayed open. HarmonyOS was insurance, not a coup. But insurance only matters once you actually need to file the claim, and you kept building as though he already knew the door would eventually close all the way, whether or not the rest of the world believed him. The fork was not the finish line. It was the first draft of a 5-year argument, and the real break in that argument was still 5 years away. Here is the problem. Nobody in 2019 wanted to say out loud about a scaling operating system. Most systems are built for one kind of device and then stretched badly to fit every other kind. A phone operating system forced onto a laptop feels cramped. A laptop operating system forced onto a wearable feels bloated, draining a battery meant to last a week in a single afternoon. Think of it, like designing one skeleton and expecting it to hold up a house, a boat, and a bicycle without changing its shape. Every previous attempt at a universal operating system had tried to stretch one skeleton across incompatible bodies, and every one of them had snapped somewhere in the middle. Huawei's engineers made a different bet. Instead of one rigid core forced onto every device, they built a microkernel, a stripped-down center that handles only the most essential functions, with everything else added in modular layers depending on what the device actually needed. A smart speaker gets a thin layer. A car gets a thick one. The skeleton does not change shape for each body. It grows or shrinks the muscle around itself instead, adding only what a given device actually has to carry. This was the exact problem Richard Yu had been circling since before HarmonyOS had a name. One operating system, every device. No separate code bases to maintain. No version of the software that Huawei did not fully control. The bet was not just technical. It was a bet that a company nobody trusted yet to build software could out-architect two giants who had been doing it for 30 years, using an approach neither Microsoft nor Google had bothered to try at that scale. The early proof came quietly, on hardware nobody was watching. Smart screens, then wearables, then routers, each running a version of the same core, each reporting back data that the architecture actually held under real-world conditions rather than falling apart the moment it left the lab. By the time Huawei's own engineers were confident enough to talk about it publicly, HarmonyOS had already been quietly running on tens of millions of devices most customers didn't even realize were part of the same experiment. A flexible skeleton is not the same thing as a living body. An operating system with no apps running on it is still, as far as most users are concerned, that beautifully engineered brick. And in 2019, HarmonyOS did not have a single meaningful app to its name. Here is the brutal catch. Nobody in Huawei's engineering division could design their way around. A phone operating system with no Android app compatibility is functionally useless to a mainstream customer, and Huawei knew it. For years, HarmonyOS quietly kept a piece of Android's open-source code running underneath its own architecture, like a scaffold left standing after the building around it is finished, purely so existing apps would still open. It worked. It also meant Huawei was never actually free of the thing it claimed to have replaced, no matter how much of its own engineering sat on top of that scaffold. Then, in October of 2024, on the Mate 70 series, Huawei did something that should have been suicidal. It launched HarmonyOS Next, a version of the operating system that removed every trace of that Android scaffolding. No AOSP code, no compatibility layer. Every app that had ever run on a Huawei phone before, that moment simply stopped working the day the update landed. It sounds like it should not work, and that is exactly why it does. Yu's team had watched competitors and analysts predict, loudly, that pulling the scaffold out would collapse the entire ecosystem overnight. Developers would abandon the platform. Users would flee to Android devices where their existing apps still functioned. Internally, teams reportedly pushed back on the timeline itself, arguing China's own developer base was not ready to rebuild hundreds of thousands of apps from scratch on a new native framework in time for a hard launch date. Yu made the bet anyway, wagering that the sheer size of the Chinese market alone would force developers to follow rather than lose access to it entirely. They followed. Within roughly a year of that decision, HarmonyOS and HarmonyOS Next combined had passed 900 million active devices, more users than the entire population of Europe, all running an operating system that 5 years earlier could not run a single native application of its own. The bet did not just survive. It was the moment the insurance policy finally paid out in full. But a phone ecosystem surviving its own amputation is one kind of miracle. Turning that same architecture into something that could sit on a desk and replace an entire company's laptops was an entirely different problem, and it was about to get tested in public. A phone and a laptop are not the same kind of promise to a user. A phone has to open apps and take calls. A laptop has to run 20-year-old file formats. Talk to printers nobody has serviced since 2015 and behave exactly the way an office expects it to behave, every single day without complaint for years at a time. For over a decade, Huawei's own MateBook laptops had quietly shipped with a fully licensed copy of Windows pre-installed, because building a laptop operating system from scratch was considered a different order of difficulty than building one for a phone. Then, on May 19, 2025, that changed. Huawei launched its first laptops running HarmonyOS instead of Windows, timed almost exactly to the expiration of its Windows OEM licensing arrangement. This was not a side project. Huawei's own tablet and PC division head said publicly that the effort behind it involved more than 2,700 core patents, 5 years of dedicated research, over 10,000 engineers, and 20 separate research institutes working in parallel. Here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. The laptop did not need to reinvent the wheel on file systems and legacy compatibility from zero, because it was inheriting 5 years of architecture already proven on 900 million phones, tablets, and wearables. Picture one set of house keys that opens every door in the building instead of a separate key for every single room. Your phone, your tablet, and now your laptop, all recognizing each other instantly, sharing files and notifications without a single extra login or a single extra password. That is the coordination layer Huawei had actually been building since the microkernel decision back in 2019. The laptop was not a new invention. It was the last room in a house that had already been under construction for years. The market noticed almost immediately. Independent analysts at Omdia tracked HarmonyOS PC shipments at just 141,000 units in 2025, a rounding error in a global PC market measured in the hundreds of millions. Their forecast for 2026 put that number at 1.4 million units, a tenfold increase in a single year, while the broader global PC market was expected to shrink by roughly 12%. That shipment jump alone would have been an impressive story on its own. It was not the number that mattered most. The number that mattered most needed independent confirmation before anyone in the industry would take it seriously. Here is the honest picture. GfK, one of the largest independent market research firms in the world, confirmed that HarmonyOS PCs had captured 70% of China's high-end laptop segment within months of that May 2025 launch. Not a projection and not a company claim. A measured figure pulled from real retail sales data across thousands of stores. Translate that into human terms, and it means this. In the specific slice of the market where Chinese consumers spend the most money and pay the closest attention to what they are buying, 7 out of every 10 premium laptop buyers walked out of a store with a machine that had never touched a line of Windows code. And here is the trade-off that keeps this honest. Windows still held roughly 80% of China's entire PC operating system market in early 2025, across every price tier combined. Harmony. OS's win is real, and it is contained almost entirely to one premium slice of one national market. It has not touched the broader Windows installed base, and it has barely begun its international expansion. The forced upgrade tailwind helping it along is real too, Microsoft ended support for Windows 10 in October of 2025, pushing millions of users toward a decision about their next machine at exactly the moment Huawei had something new to put in front of them. None of that makes the number smaller. It just means the war is nowhere near finished, even where Huawei is winning outright. Richard Yu had said back in 2024 that Huawei had achieved in 10 years what it took the United States and Europe more than 30 years to build: a fully independent, functioning operating system stack. The 70% figure is not just a market share statistic. It is the first hard, external, unbiased confirmation that the bet he made in a bluff-sounding statement 6 years earlier had actually worked, in a category, laptops, that HarmonyOS was never even built for at the start. If that laptop number surprised you, the next part is going to be even harder to believe. Hit subscribe so you are there when we cover it. This is not just one company's laptop winning market share. It is the first real evidence that the operating system industry's oldest assumption, that Microsoft and Google's duopoly is simply the permanent floor everyone builds on, might not be permanent after all. For more than 30 years, building a third operating system from nothing has been treated by the entire industry as functionally impossible. Not because the engineering was too hard, but because no company had ever solved the chicken and egg problem of developers and users needing each other to exist first. Counterpoint Research, the analytics firm tracking mobile operating systems worldwide, has confirmed HarmonyOS's climb past Apple's iOS in China for 6 consecutive quarters, a trend line that did not exist 5 years ago in any serious analyst's forecast. What adoption actually requires is not a patent portfolio. It requires convincing airlines, banks, ride-hailing apps, and messaging platforms outside China to build for a system with no existing user base in their market. The same chicken and egg problem every failed challenger before Huawei ran into, and the same problem that quietly killed Windows Phone and Tizen before it ever reached this stage. Huawei's confirmed international expansion, beginning in 2026, targets Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East first, regions where its telecom equipment already gave it years of institutional trust to build on, long before this laptop ever shipped. There is a historical parallel worth sitting with here. When Android first launched in 2008, serious analysts dismissed it as a clumsy also-ran with no realistic path to challenging Apple's head start. It took roughly 4 years for Android to become the best-selling smartphone operating system on Earth. Nobody in 2008 believed that timeline was possible either, and the people who dismissed it fastest were the ones closest to the industry. The genuine technical advantage here is harder to copy than a patent filing because it is not one invention. It is a 5-year architecture decision that happened to be validated by 6 years of forced adaptation nobody chose voluntarily. The ceiling that mattered was never political. It was the ordinary, brutal difficulty of building a functioning software ecosystem from zero, the same ceiling that has broken every serious challenger before this one, regardless of how much money or engineering talent they started with. And if a laptop operating system quietly clawing away market share while everyone was distracted by phones is something you want to go deeper on, I already covered how this exact same company is doing something similar to a much bigger target, Apple. That video is worth your time because the playbook is identical and the target this time is even harder to dislodge. Here's the largest thing to take from all of this. For 30 years, the operating system business ran on an assumption that nobody, anywhere, ever needed to test, that the barrier to entry was simply too high for a challenger to survive crossing it. That assumption just failed its first real test in 6 years, and it did not fail quietly. If you made it this far, you now understand more about how operating systems actually get built and unbuilt than most people who write about this industry for a living. Here's what was actually proven. A company legally cut off from 2 of the largest software platforms on Earth designed its own architecture, survived tearing out its own safety net when that architecture matured, and turned the resulting system into a laptop operating system that an independent research firm confirmed now leads China's premium segment. Windows is not finished. Nobody serious is claiming that. What is finished is the assumption that it never had to compete for that segment at all, anywhere, from anyone. Richard Yu said it would happen in 6 years, and almost nobody believed him at the time. The 70% figure did not make him right by accident. It made him right on a schedule he stated publicly before the first version of this operating system had a single working app. If this changed how you think about who gets to build the software the rest of the world runs on, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Is a company hitting 70% of one premium market segment inside its home country a genuine industry-shaking win? Or does it only really count once it can do the same thing without a captive domestic market and government procurement working in its favor? I read every single one. See you in the next one.